And I usually have all of, well, since I'm spotlit, then you guys don't usually really show up in the stream. So I hope that's okay because it definitely helps. And it is unlisted on. I usually have all of, and then I can mute that. All right, cool. We have a backup. We're ready to go. Are edits considered a style of dance? I don't know. What's an edit? Please tell me.
Have you seen those cool like skateboard or mountain bike videos where people do like tricks and it's synced to music?
No. Well, yeah, I guess I have, but I hadn't heard the term edit. But is that a style of dance? Oh, why not?
I
I would
think
say
it's
yes.
like a montage in a way.
Yeah, a montage of like bike tricks. I
Yeah,
mean,
like, but it's like the whole purpose of it is like it's synced up with the music as well. So it's kind of like instead of dancing in a traditional sense, you're dancing, let's say, with a bike instead.
yeah, I think I would, if I were to classify that, I would say that that is somewhere in between. It's got elements of circus, right? Because you definitely have circus bike tricks, and those are sometimes choreographed to music. And then you have the technology editing part of it, which is a postmodern element when you're talking about dance. But yeah, I mean, we're going to get down to that. I, being a postmodernist, think that anything can be dance. So I would say yes. How about anybody else? Can you chat me your favorite dance style or just call it out? Or you could say something like, I don't know what the names of dance styles are. Please.
Would YouTube video links work or no?
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you asked me that question because I'm going to tell you something that I think sucks. um, due to copyright rules. Now, when we're in a college setting, there is something called fair use, which means that in order to further your education, we're supposed to get to watch videos, right? And anything that is on YouTube is already up in public domain. But when I am making a Zoom recording or doing a backup recording, both of those things are technically copying. And so when we watch YouTube videos, and I'm terrible at this, I'm going to just own that right up. I should be interrupting them, only showing you little tiny clips and then blanking off. And so I'm going to try and be a little bit better at that because there's definitely been lectures that I've recorded where I've like shown a whole dance scene, like the big dance scene in Jingle Jangle that I think we're going to watch today. And then like the whole video gets like a giant X from YouTube on it. It's awful. So, yeah, if you're ever watching this discussion and you're feeling frustrated with me stopping and starting a dance, which of course re-edits the dancing, you'll kind of know that that's part of why I'm doing it, and it's thumbs down. But ballroom Latin dancing, lovely. I wish I had done more of that myself. Okay, so we're going to get started here. I'm sorry, I don't have all my windows pulled up properly. Please bear with me for a moment. Pull up this, and I'm going to pull up the we're going to start right off checking out a video that I know is going to make YouTube angry at us. Okay. So, what is hip-hop dancing? Does anybody want to give that a shot answering that question? I know it's a huge question to ask. I don't actually expect anybody to be like, I'll give it a try, but I would
give it a try. Can I give it a try?
Yes, I would love that.
It's a genre of popular music developed in the United States by inner city African Americans, Puerto Rican, and Jamaicans in the Bronx of New York City in the 1970s. I'm just guessing.
Yes, that is very accurate, especially when it comes to the music. Right? That's the basis of, well, okay, two things. I'm glad we're having this. We're already starting with semantics, which is great. So when we say hip hop, we could be discussing hip hop culture, which has 5 elements, yes. And I'm really excited that that is becoming more common knowledge. So we're going to work with that. What you just discussed is, I would say, hip hop culture and music, talking about how the music, the DJing, the break beats, and the break dancing that came from the Black, Puerto Rican, and Jamaican people in the Bronx in New York City. It's definitely one huge beginning section of where hip hop dance came from. But it is not the beginning, yeah? So we're going to talk about all the influences that bring us to what hip hop dancing is now in 2022. A huge chunk of that is from those 1970s dancers and DJs, right? But there's even more than that. They're simultaneous and slightly afterwards to the groups of dancers in New York City. We also have the West Coast poppers and lockers, electric boogaloo. So like popping comes from West Coast, or like SF Bay Area and LA, so we can feel a little pride there. And also New York. But a lot of those dance moves did not originate at that time. If we just move a little bit further back in the same communities, a lot of the dance moves that we see expressed in that 1970s dancing, especially the popping and locking, had been done in different forms on, I'm going to throw out like a bunch of terms that we'll dive into as the semester goes on. So it's okay if you're like, what's the Chitlin Circuit? But the Chitlin Circuit, which is the name of the tour trip that Black performers in particular took in America when they were doing shows. For example, James Brown, who would on tour gather different regional dance moves from communities as he was on tour in America and put those into his show. And then James Brown was imitated by and learned, like his dance moves were learned by Michael Jackson when he was part of the Jackson 5. Yeah, so that's 80s. That started in the 70s. And then even before the 70s, we have like neater, cleaner versions of those moves were in Motown, like backup singer movement, really simplified steps. So let's push even further back in time, pre-Motown. When you think about the really fast steps, and we'll get to try a little bit of these, but when you think about the really fast steps that are in, for example, up rocking in breakdancing, you know, when they're doing the footwork, those steps actually come from community dances. I'm going to bring it even further back, but a lot of those come from swing dancing, the Charleston and the Lindy Hop in the 1920s. And then those steps come even further back from the slaves who came to America, both North America and Middle America, through the Middle Passage in 1619. And at that stage, when they arrived in America, a lot of the variations on those dance moves are called buck and jig dances. And so we'll talk a bit about what those styles look like at that stage. And then even further back, of course, is before the Middle Passage, that many of those dances were community and regional dances within Africa. And that's just tracing the African diasporic part of the dances. But there is always fusion and hybridity. So last week, if you got to the reading, I hope it was like, oh my gosh, what is this? Because that would be when I first read it, I was like, whoa, we're getting heavy here already. So we're going to rewind it from that heaviness and we're going to make that a little more accessible. So now that we've taken sort of a little backward path, I'd like to know if you guys got from that article a sense, and you can like guess this out with me, of the difference between hybrid dance as a term and fusion dance as a term. Put that in a little chat here. Hybrid dance versus fusion dance. And mostly I just want to like have us learn these two terms so that we can use them together. Does anybody want to take a guess at what those are? Sip my coffee, wait for some volunteers. Not quite sure? Okay, so They generally mean the same thing, which is that two different styles of dance come together and become something that is new. New is always in quotation marks. Um, when we use the word fusion, we are going to choose as a class, based on that article, based on other academic learning, we're going to choose as a class to use the word fusion, meaning there might be some appropriation in there. Yeah? So fusion versus hybrid. Fusion with a suggestion of appropriation would mean that you have a choreographer, right? A person who is making a dance. And they perhaps specialize in modern dance. I'll use myself as an example. So my training is mostly in modern dance, also mostly in jazz. And let's say I went to one West African dance class. This is true. And I loved this one step that I learned. Like a dance is only one step. It's not. And I loved the drumming. And then I came back and I made a whole 10-minute dance piece and I called it like West African fusion, where I used that step and that music for perhaps, and mostly my modern dance training, and didn't check it back in with the instructor that I worked with, and just kind of made it up and then like put a label on top. Appropriation, right? Right now, appropriation is considered very inappropriate. Sorry, I'm laughing at my dad jokes here. But it has not always been that way, and it is not always deemed inappropriate. So, yes, Nat.
I'm kind of confused about appropriation.
Okay, good.
It's a term that gets tossed around a lot. And so let's say, in terms of food, I feel like I'll understand it better, and then we can probably apply this into dance. So is it basically like saying if a white person were to open up a taqueria, that would be considered appropriation?
Great example. Yes. But this is such a great example. Thank you so much, Ned. Because there's also the term hybrid. So appropriative fusion might be like a white person just opens a taqueria, is like, this is Edgar's taqueria. Maybe that was a bad word.
But like, why is appropriation a bad thing?
Good question. Let me tell you what hybrid is, and then it might be a little more clear. And it's really about giving credit and proper knowledge. Proper is not the right word here. Authentic knowledge. So a hybrid taqueria might be like, yeah, maybe Jimmy Joe opened a taqueria, but it turns out that Jimmy Joe was adopted by his Mexican uncle who cooked with him in the kitchen his whole life. And so when Jimmy Joe went back to his cousin and grandparents' house, he was making Swedish fish. And then, but most of the time he was hanging out with his uncle making tacos. And so he decided to make lutefisk tacos that were both recipes that he was trained by people who were authentic to those cuisines. And then Jimmy Joe put them together and you had lutefisk tacos. I can't believe we just got to lutefisk tacos. You just made my day, Ned. Ew. I bet I'd like it because it's so weird. Does that kind of help?
It doesn't really answer the question on why it's bad.
Yes, because appropriation usually involves one person or creator who is making a fusion from a position of power using the intellectual property of a community, usually of less power. And that's part of what that Sally Baines article is talking about, is that we currently say like, ooh, fusion is new. Now we have Asian fusion food, and we have modern dance fused with hip hop, and it's called lyrical hip hop. And I'm going to make this mistake at some point this semester. You just laugh at me when I do, okay, guys? But the problem is, where is the credit going for that intellectual property? And is that intellectual property being named, honored, or are the profits from that intellectual property going to the most recent user of that property? Is it accidentally creating a misrepresentation of um, a community that has typically been oppressed? And in particular, since we're talking about the Western world, and I'm going to use the word Western Eurocentric a lot, which means like Europe, North America, basically most of the countries where we speak English, or we're mostly like this, we're not even going to get to say this for very much longer, but like white majority countries. So Sweden, for example, would count as Western European. Sorry, I was just reading about cinnamon buns, so that's why I keep talking about Sweden. So the problem is that this idea of fusion and our assumption that it's okay to borrow from other cultures comes from a position of privilege in the first place. Now, obviously, I am a white girl who went to college because you have to have a master's degree to teach community college. So you know already from the start, and this is great to discuss in class, put it on the table, that I have some privilege, yes, and that it does influence the way that I've seen things. And that's part of the reason I even wanted to teach this class, is because my training as a dancer took place at college, and especially the academic part of it, there were no classes on hip hop when I went to college. And if there was a hip hop class at UC Berkeley. This is not true anymore, so please don't hold these colleges to this. They've improved. There was a hip hop dance class that you could take, but it was a graduate, not quite full credit, like sort of recreational class. Yeah, because they didn't put that into the courses that would move you towards your degree, and they weren't taught by professors at that time, and that is not true anymore. Push for Latanya Tigner, who is teaching there now, who we're going to talk about some of her work later. So what does that mean? That means that when students came to college and university 20 years ago, and I'm hoping that you and I together in going through this class are going to change that. It means that you got the impression that hip hop is not a worthy or real or high art dance, that it doesn't count culturally, that it's not valuable because of the way that it was just separate. Yeah? And yet, in Western dance, this is part of what that Baines article is talking about, forever, basically, there's always this push to create something new. So when we're talking about Western Eurocentric dance, especially concert dance, so when I say concert dance, I'm usually meaning that it's on a stage as opposed to on a dance floor where everybody's participating, and that you're probably paying $15 plus up to $300 a ticket. Yeah, concert dance. Capital C, I guess. And this is changing too, which is a good thing. But that we've always wanted to see something new, and so there's always been a pressure for choreographers to do something that was beyond their original training, and that usually meant borrowing from other cultures. And since America and Europe was way better about this, we will learn all about, than we were, but particularly in America, because we had such absolute segregation, racial segregation, including in our concert halls, then we were also separating out economically the price that was paid for tickets, because in a segregated world you can't earn as much money as a person of color as you can as a white person. And that means that a white dancer who gets Western Eurocentric dance training has a chance to perform on a white segregated stage is going to make more money than the person of color who can't go to a segregated white dance class to learn that style, even if that were what they wanted. Of course, the white dancers in the 1920s would go to Harlem to learn the black dances of that time. But the other way around, like the black dancers couldn't go, certainly not in the South. In many places, they couldn't go, for example, to a dance class in a ballet studio, or they couldn't afford it because they were getting paid significantly less for whatever job that they were doing. And those stages on the Chitlin circuit versus the white vaudeville circuit were paying the performers less because the tickets were less expensive because the audiences had less money, right? But on the white touring track, you have performers who are getting paid more because the tickets are more expensive because the audience has more money. All of those are affected by racial segregation. And that also separates styles of dance. And remember, we were talking about who can go to what dance classes. The privileged dancers or studiers of dance, and they were often very open-minded, would love to learn other dance styles so that they could gain this valued diversity in their movement or newness, right? You didn't just have to do ballet or square dancing or Irish dancing. You could move your Irish step dancing moves mixed in with dances from the African community in your area. So that would mean buck and wing dances. And that fusion right there is how we got tap dance, which is foundational to hip hop for sure. But like tap dance in particular is sort of the exception that proves that rule, because Irish people in this country were, let me be very clear, because there are some terrible conspiracy theories about the social position of Irish immigrants in America in comparison to slaves that equate the two. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that's just absolutely not true. And in fact, making that not true was a purposeful act by slave owners. But because originally Irish immigrants who were indentured servants when they arrived were often forced to live and work with the African slaves, their two dances did become a hybrid form, tap, because they were living and dancing together. So you have two people who are sharing their movement, teaching it to each other, and it over time becomes a hybrid form. And that is very different than a dancer of privilege stopping by to learn another dance form. This happened all the time in the 1920s. And then going on stage and performing it and making money that didn't make it back to the authentic creators or practitioners or teachers of that form. And sometimes those dancers really wanted to give that credit, and some of those famous dancers did give that credit. But because of the social structure, keeping those original dancers who may have been better than the white performer from performing on those stage, keeping those dancers from earning those incomes, keeping everybody apart, that's where appropriation becomes a problem. Did that help clarify your question then?
I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm still kind of lost on it because it's like maybe in a modern context, it means different things. But if you can't tell the difference, let's say I gave somebody who, let's say, is, well, because I feel like it's an issue of who can you attribute, let's say, a dance to. Like, for example, oh, here's a good one. Israelis and Palestinians, they're both in the same area, right? They say they create the hummus, right?
Okay.
Right now, Israelis are in power. So would it be wrong? Would it be right to say Israelis are appropriating Palestinian culture or otherwise the other way? Because I feel like it's who can you say gets credit for it? And I feel like you can't really say somebody gets credit, and saying appropriation is bad, that means somebody's doing something wrong. So that's why I was kind of like in my head trying to figure it out.
I think that's an excellent example of how confusing it can be. in general, yes, appropriation is linked to the difference in power. And it gets really complicated when you have two communities that were once one. And so nobody's really sure where the origin of the dance came from. In fact, perhaps it was a hybrid dance all along. I certainly don't know. I'm not suggesting that that's actually true in that situation. But I imagine that's sort of maybe the discussion or the finer points of the confusion. And so appropriation comes into account when the community of privilege, because the community of privilege essentially owns, I'm making a general term here, but essentially owns the control over the modes of distribution, right? So the community of privilege probably owns more of the theaters. The community of privilege probably owns more of the video cameras and film studios and television stations and radio stations that would distribute a piece of art and collect income from that piece of art. So if the community of privilege says, this is my dance, please pay me for it, and they're leaving out the other community, maybe they're not even. Maybe they're like, this is a hybrid dance, but please pay me for it. This community that participated in the creation isn't getting credit. And that's really where the question of appropriation comes in. It's not that one should never do a dance that they didn't create. It's not that we shouldn't have hybrid dancing. It's that we should be, if we're in the position of privilege, we should be constantly naming where things came from and trying to give that credit back and one of the ways we give credit back is to pay authentic teachers to teach us to be better. So let's say I really had fun in a West African dance class that I took when I was over at the Alvin Ailey Dance Studios a few years back, doing a teacher training in a modern dance technique. But they were like, hey, take other classes at night. The way that I would keep myself from appropriating as much as possible, and in some ways there's no getting around it, is that I would take class from the authentic practitioner so that I'm paying that instructor and his musicians to learn from them, as opposed to just, oh, and this is terrible because we're going to do this, watching a video and then like they didn't get any money from it and we just go on and be like, hey, I now am the authority on West African dance, right? We want to keep giving credit back. For example, saying, you know, this is where I learned this dance move. And we'll notice as we talk this week about community dances that there's really an effort within community dancing. Sorry, I'm like falling in and out of the light here. I don't mean to be going all mystical, but I am. When you learn hip hop dancing in a community setting versus from YouTube videos, and this is a generalization, so of course it's going to be partially wrong. You might, for example, lots of people learn to dance with their community and family. So you might be at home with your parents and your parents say, hey, we're going to dance and let me show you this bachata step. And this is how you move your hips when we do this bachata step. And I'm going to hold you in the dance position that we use. And then you might go to a party in your neighborhood and dance with other people and other families, and you know, your next door neighbor is like, oh, I do this bachata step, but I do it a little bit wider when I do it, so then your hips move more, so look at my version of it. And then among the community, let's say there's 3 versions of it, and like as you dance together for a few years at a few different parties, you blend those things together and you end up with your community bachata step being a little bit wider, but not as much hip movement, and this particular set of arms, for example. But then 2 counties over, you have a similar thing going on, right? 3 families all doing the bachata. You know, perhaps their grandparents all came from the same city outside of America where they all learned it together, right? But then we get this telephone action happening. And in this other community, maybe the community tends to stick with the narrower footprint and have a lot more hips and does their arms a different hold, like they're closer up together. For example, I'm just making this up, right? Then we have two different steps that have the same name, but they look different. And this is very true in regional dancing, which is why dance evolves. It's a living craft. So what happens if you're playing telephone, and in the example I just gave you, we had two like authentic community evolutions of a dance step, right? But what happens if the third example is that there's a touring dance teacher who goes and learns this bachata step from one of those two communities, and then takes that bachata step back to their town and teaches a bunch of other people that bachata step, but they also add their little twist on it, but they still call it bachata. But then they decide, I really love this song, so I'm going to teach this bachata step to David Bowie. And that teacher teaches 50 people the bachata with no hips to David Bowie, because that's just what they wanted to do. Or, maybe they were bad at doing the hips. Who knows? Now you have 50 people, very possibly with more privilege and more influence on culture just because of that privilege, who now are calling something a bachata step that has turned out rather different. Not through any negative intentions, but they're going to go and do the bachata step and have fun doing the bachata step and spreading this name around. And new people who come to learn the dance from them are going to look at the authentic practitioners and be like, that's not how you do it. And I'm going to take class from this person, not from these authentic practitioners, because that's what I've been told it's supposed to look like. That's appropriation. And another term for it is whitewashing. If this instructor over here was teaching it and saying, I'm not doing this very authentically, I'm obviously not an authentic practitioner, this is my way of doing it, but you should really check out this person over here that I learned it from. They teach it better than I can, and if you can get to them, I encourage you to do so. Or look at over in Texas, they do the bachata even differently than the person that I learned from in New Mexico. Then you have not so much appropriation. You have someone who's attempting to give credit where it's due, as opposed to, there's lots of dances, we're going to look at some of them, especially in the early 1900s, like 1920s, where dances that clearly came from the African communities in America are just entirely whitewashed. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. We're going to talk a lot about this in the second category about economics, because it's definitely appropriative, and it's definitely whitewashing, and it's definitely racist. Often totally not intentionally, and often very intentionally. The problem is, it's so much promotion, increase in popularity, increase in the nation's awareness. If it's done well, where you're really giving credit from a position of power to the original creators of a dance, you can help them to get more economic opportunities. But even that setup is a bit like privileged, economically unfair. And so it has been a really central to this American culture and central to hip hop culture's issue about whether appropriation is, it's just not all clearly good or bad. When it's appropriation, we usually mean that not enough credit's being given, things are being whitewashed, real culture, original culture is being lost. But hybrid dance, if that person who is in a place of privilege is going back, lifting up, giving credit, continuing to learn from and respect the culture from which they're learning, and adding in their cultural background so that you end up with two cultures integrating their dance movement, that might have the benefits of increased popularity for the less privileged culture's work without the whitewashing, erasure, and abuse of intellectual property. Does that help to clarify? It's such a good question. I'm really glad we're taking time on this.
It really makes sense now. It's like, if it's basically, it's just such a wide term, and if it's becoming to the point where things are kind of getting whitewashed, or like any sort of like it's kind of like, yeah, exactly, like if their culture is being, if the general consensus of what the culture is being changed as a result, it's it's negative.
Yeah.
I could find more. I was just thinking about it, so I can find a more elegant way.
No, that's great. That's great. If that is what we can get out of this first discussion, then we have had some serious success, is to really think about it. And I'm trying to think about, like, should we switch gears, guys? Should we move on to a little bit more talking about community dances? You have so much in your video watch list this week, which is really exciting. So you're going to watch a lot of community dances from Africa. We're going to talk about how those dances came. I especially love to talk about, let me just pause there. I especially love to talk about Mutwashi dancing, which is seriously hip movement based, and that there are different kinds of hip movement, like forward and back. There's I think in one of your tried out videos, we have an Afro beats, which is a pretty modern community dance from Africa, where the pelvis is pushing forward, like it did in the 90s for the Tootsie Roll and the Humpty Dance. I was like, ooh, gotta go back. When the pelvis goes back, you're sticking your butt out. That would be twerking, right? When you're doing salsa dance, you're making often a figure 8 with the hips side to side. And we can see elements of many of those hip movements in the movements of the hips that came from Africa, right? So you have slaves coming to Haiti, for example, meeting and dancing with the native people of those islands, coming after procreating, getting transported to America. So now you have those Latin dances that came from Central America, moved, like hybridized with African diasporic dances. Those slaves get transported to America. And then in America, we have the dances mixing together. Well, some mixing and some not mixing, right? We have definitely still Latin influence going on, especially as you go to the west and skip up high north. And then also you have the influences from Spain that plugged into those Latin dances with the Spanish and Portuguese slave owners, and the ballroom dance influence and the flamenco dance influence that they infused into ballroom dancing. But then as the slaves come into America and they're put in the same tenement housing as the Irish indentured servants, who had the jig dances from Ireland and also the step dancing, which is all this really fast footwork and bounciness, as opposed to buck dancing, which is really down and low, and wing dancing, which is all of these like swinging your knees. In fact, I was just mentioning the Tootsie Roll earlier in the 90s, which is like where this duck thing comes from. All of that came all the way back to 1619. So when we're talking about community dances, we're talking about how those dances happened as, I found my transition. Okay, so how those dances happen as a way to release stress and to spend time with your family and neighbors and to build a sense of belonging and community, especially for communities which were snatched from their homeland. Their families were broken by slavery. Half the people died on the ship, so they're all traumatized and they're just trying to have a good time because it sucks, right? So then, even furthermore, one of the things that is important for me to have you guys understand is, how does dancing become not just fun, but activism? Because it often is. Hi, Jack. And so I want to take a moment. Now, I have this. Do I have this link right here? Because that would be great. I think I pulled it up already for you guys. I do. Okay, good. Let me share my screen. Pull up. this video. Okay, so the first time I taught this class was the summer of 2020 when we had Black Lives Matter riots going on this protests, sorry. There were responses which were riots. These were protests. I apologize for that misstatement. Please accept my apology and understand I know the difference. What I wanted to make sure that we understand is at the time there was a lot of discussion that was very positive about how much we need this change to respect African American culture in this country. And also there were some unfortunate, that's not even the right word, there were some bigoted conversations about just the lies that many people have been taught in America about what African Americans went through as slaves, and Black people and people of color in this country in general, how they've been treated in this country. And honestly, there are places where, especially, I mean, I don't want to make a generalist comment. I'd like to think their education is not as bad in California, but the same sort of sins happen in California. For example, I'm a Californian, and I learned that the missions were lovely places where Native Americans helped to build these adobe churches, and we all farmed together. It was very nice, and that's some BS. Of course those things are true, but it's also true that they were places of genocide, that they were essentially slave labor forced into working and living at the missions because they didn't really have a choice, either through starvation or because the white people brought smallpox or through actual physical coercion, and that children were beaten there and people died there. But, you know, I built a beautiful little adobe church along with all the other little kids in my class in the 90s. So that kind of BS has happened all over this country, especially concerning slavery. And I have some family that is from the South, and they say some shocking things sometimes. And so I wanted to start this class with, and I apologize, this is a white teacher in this video because it would be way better if it were not. A little tiny moment to clarify that
now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers or
Black
masters.
people
like Bob, the guy who received
did
the
not
arbitrary beating, responded to it by
submit
killing his
to
overseer with a
slavery
hoe. But
willingly.
that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The four most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane knives and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slavery had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns, or sabotaging equipment, or pretending not to understand instructions. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out an identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back. And in the end, They won. I'll see you next week. Crash courses.
So that is what I want us to start this semester with, is that knowledge that a lot of the time dance and community dancing was a form of fighting back against oppression, that being more human, that really solidifying through community practice the dances that make you feel joy and make you feel human is an act of resistance against oppression. So I think, that's a good place to end today as you go and watch a bunch of videos. And then next week we'll come back, we'll look at more of those dance videos. We talked a little bit about how Buck and Wing translated into the Charleston and how you can see evidence of that in like 90s hip hop dances. And we'll talk about more of the actual dance moves and look at them next week. But for now, let's let that idea sink in. And hopefully next week you guys can bring me some more great questions about like, I get it, but it just doesn't quite make sense to me, because those are really the way that we're going to get like deep together. Yeah. And I want that. I want you guys to feel free to ask questions. I really appreciate your bravery in asking questions. It's okay to like private chat them to me if you're not feeling like speaking up, although I definitely encourage you to speak up. And that said, it's noon and I'm going to let you guys all go and see you next week. Sound good?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I'd love to hear next week, like, what's your favorite video that you watched?
Thank you,
And then we can do
Professor.
a little deep
Sounds
dive.
good.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.